The marble floors of the JFK first-class lounge check-in area are designed to absorb sound. They are built for quiet conversations, the soft click of leather heels, and the polite murmurs of people who do not need to raise their voices to be heard. But on this particular Tuesday morning, that expensive acoustic system was being violently tested by my younger sister, Chloe. Her voice, shrill and dripping with absolute hysteria, echoed past the velvet ropes. "You cannot be serious. You are stealing this from my children. This is a family vacation. Maya, you are a selfish, pathetic, lonely old woman." Her face was a mottled, blotchy red, clashing horrifically with the oversized, fake designer sunglasses she had pushed up into her bleached blonde hair. Beside her, her 3 teenagers were furiously tapping on their iPhones, entirely disconnected from the reality of the scene their mother was causing, annoyed only by the delay. Her husband, Greg, was aggressively sweating through his custom-tailored shirt, his eyes darting around nervously as airport security began a slow, deliberate approach. I stood exactly 3 feet away from them, wearing an unbranded, impossibly soft, charcoal cashmere sweater. My heart rate hadn't elevated a single beat. I didn't flinch. I didn't shout back. I simply turned my attention back to my phone. I opened a secure messaging app, navigated to the contact listed simply as Marcus, Acquisitions, and typed a single, perfectly punctuated sentence. Liquidate Greg's holding company. Call in all the margins. Now I watched the tiny delivery checkmark appear. I locked my phone, slipped it into my coat pocket, and handed my dark blue, heavily stamped passport to the terrified airline agent behind the mahogany desk. "Just the one ticket to Charles de Gaulle, please," I said, my voice smooth, quiet, and perfectly steady. "Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled my sister's fake rich empire, piece by agonizing piece, while sipping a vintage 2008 Dom Perignon at 30,000 feet, dome a favor. Let me know in the comments below where you are listening from right now. And hit that subscribe button if you believe that toxic entitlement shouldn't just be corrected, it should be punished with absolute, undeniable ruin." Let's rewind the clock. 6 months earlier, if you had asked anyone in my family, my mother, my aunts, and especially Chloe, who Maya was, they would have painted a very specific, very dreary picture. To them, I was the 50-year-old spinster, the boring, mid-level accountant who drove a remarkably clean, 5-year-old beige sedan. I wore neutral colors. I lived in a modest apartment in Queens, and I never, ever talked about money. I was the reliable, invisible backdrop against which my sister painted her vibrant, chaotic, unsuccessful life. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know because I intentionally designed my life to be a fortress of silence. In reality, I am a senior managing partner at one of the most ruthless, distressed asset private equity firms in Manhattan. While my family thought I was balancing small business ledgers, I was actually managing a multi-billion-dollar portfolio, specializing in corporate restructuring. Simply put, I buy the debt of foolish, over-leveraged companies, gut them, and sell the pieces. I don't just understand money. I understand the brutal, unforgiving psychology of it. I prefer quiet luxury, the kind of wealth that doesn't need a logo to announce its presence, the kind of wealth that allows you to buy a building just to fire the landlord who annoyed you. My sister, Chloe, and her husband, Greg, represented the exact opposite. They were the very definition of the modern American illusion. Chloe, at 46, was a walking billboard for financial insecurity masked as opulence. She thrived on the aesthetic of wealth. Her entire existence was curated for social media. She wore belts with buckles so massive and garish, they looked like wrestling championship belts. Her wrists were stacked with loud, clinking bracelets. She smelled perpetually of an overpowering end-quote, trendy floral perfume that completely masked the faint, desperate scent of cheap self-tanner. Greg was a commercial real estate developer in the suburbs. He was the kind of man who leased a brand new, top-of-the-line Range Rover every 12 months, but negotiated aggressively over a $20 tip at a restaurant. They lived in a sprawling, A hollow McMansion with a six-figure mortgage they could barely service. To the untrained eye, they were the American dream. To someone in my line of work, navigating the current U.S. economic climate of soaring inflation and crippling commercial interest rates, they were a house of cards soaked in gasoline, just begging for a match. They were drowning in high-yield, private debt, surviving month to month by shuffling money between contractors' deposit accounts. But I never said a word. I let them play their games. I let Chloe make her passive-aggressive comments at Thanksgiving about my sensible shoes and my lonely evenings. It was easier to be underestimated. It was safer. Until my 50th birthday approached. I had decided, after decades of working 80-hour weeks and building my empire in the shadows, that I was going to celebrate myself. I didn't want a loud party. I didn't want forced family bonding. I wanted Paris. I wanted 2 weeks of absolute, unadulterated indulgence. I had my assistant, a brilliant young woman named Elena, handle the arrangements. We didn't look at travel websites. We called private concierges. I booked the prestige suite at the Ritz Paris, overlooking the Place Vendôme. I arranged for private, after-hours tours of the Louvre. I secured reservations at 3 Michelin-star restaurants, where the waitlist was typically 6 months long. It was a trip designed to cost roughly the equivalent of a modest starter home in the Midwest, and I was going to pay for it in cash without blinking. The mistake was letting my guard down for a fraction of a second. It happened at our mother's house during a Sunday dinner. I had brought a simple, unlabeled bottle of wine, a rare, limited production Burgundy that cost more than Greg's leased car payment for the month, though they assumed it was a grocery store pick. "So Maya," my mother started, cutting into a dry roast, "the big 5-0 is coming up. Are you just going to stay in your apartment and read again?" "Actually," I replied softly, taking a slow sip of the phenomenal wine, "I'm taking a solo trip. To Paris." The table went dead silent. Chloe paused, her fork hovering in the air. She looked at me, her eyes sweeping over my simple beige cashmere cardigan, taking in my lack of jewelry. "Mi ba ringfinger." A slow, condescending smirk spread across her perfectly injected lips. Paris. Chloe scoffed, letting out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Maya, please. Are you going to stay in one of those youth hostels sharing a bathroom with backpackers at your age?" Greg chuckled, shaking his head. "Watch out for the pickpockets." "Maya, though, I guess they wouldn't find much in your sensible little tote bag. I'm sure it will be a quaint, little budget trip," Chloe added, waving her hand dismissively, the fake diamonds on her tennis bracelet catching the overhead light. "It's cute that you're trying to get out of your shell. Just make sure you pack good walking shoes. Taxis over there are so expensive. And we all know you're on a fixed income." I didn't correct her. I didn't tell her about the Ritz. I didn't tell her about the private driver waiting for me at Charles de Gaulle. I just looked at her. I looked at the fragile, desperate need in her eyes to feel superior to me. "Yes," I said quietly, a faint, cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. "It will be very educational." I thought that would be the end of it. I thought I would quietly pack my bags and disappear for 2 weeks. But Chloe couldn't let it go. The very idea that I was doing something for myself, even a budget trip, gnawed at her deep-seated entitlement. And a few days later, when she accidentally let herself into my apartment to drop off some mail and saw a printed copy of my preliminary itinerary sitting on my kitchen island, the real war began. Et par deux. The hijack and the humiliation. My apartment in Queens is a study in purposeful misdirection. To the untrained, label-obsessed eye like my sister's, it looks utterly unremarkable. There are no massive flat-screen televisions dominating the walls, no mirrored furniture, and absolutely no logos. But if you know what you are looking at, you would notice that the sofa is a custom piece by B&B Italia. The rugs are antique, Persian silk, and the quiet, abstract painting in the hallway is an original Rothko study. Chloe, of course, knows none of this. To her, a room isn't expensive unless it screams at you. She let herself in on a Thursday afternoon under the guise of dropping off our mother's misdelivered mail. I was at the firm, deep into a hostile acquisition of a failing logistics company, completely unaware that the security cameras in my home were recording my sister's blatant invasion of privacy. I watched the footage later. I watched her perfectly manicured, fake-tanned fingers rummage through my mail. I watched her aggressively slide open the drawer of my kitchen island. And then, I watched her freeze. She had found the heavy, cream-colored cardstock folder left by my personal concierge. Embossed on the front, in subtle gold lettering, was the itinerary for my 50th birthday. I imagine her eyes darting across the pages, struggling to comprehend the numbers and the names. Air France la Première. A private, chauffeured Bentley Mulsanne waiting on the tarmac. A two-bedroom prestige suite at the Ritz Paris, featuring a private balcony overlooking the Place Vendôme. An exclusive, after-hours viewing of the Musée d'Orsay, followed by a private tasting menu curated by Alain Ducasse himself. The total estimated value of the trip, meticulously itemized on the final page, hovered just north of $150,000. On the security footage, I saw her face morph. The initial shock evaporated, instantly replaced by a dark, twisting jealousy. And then, the true sickness of her psychology took over. Weaponized victimhood. In her mind, she didn't see an adult woman spending her own hard-earned money. She saw a resource that was being unfairly withheld from her. She saw an opportunity to hijack a masterpiece. The ambush was orchestrated for Sunday night dinner at our mother's house. I walked into the dining room wearing a simple, unadorned navy silk blouse. The atmosphere was immediately suffocating. The air was thick with the overpowering scent of Chloe's synthetic perfume and the palpable, vibrating energy of her righteous indignation. Her 3 teenagers were slouched on the couch, aggressively chewing gum and ignoring the world. Greg sat at the table, aggressively tapping his foot. His Rolex, which I happened to know, was financed on a predatory 2-4-month payment plan, catching the dim dining room light. Before my mother could even serve the salad, Chloe struck. She reached into her oversized, heavily branded Gucci tote bag and slammed a photocopied stack of paper onto the center of the dining table. It was my itinerary. Care to explain this? Maya Chloe demanded, her voice trembling with an expertly crafted blend of outrage and betrayal. I looked at the papers, then slowly lifted my gaze to meet hers. My expression remained entirely blank. It appears you've been going through my private property. Clue. Is there a question? Or are you just confessing to a felony? Don't you dare play the victim with me. She shrieked, slamming her hand on the table, rattling the cheap silverware. $150,000 on a vacation for one person. Are you out of your mind? Do you know how sick this is? It is my money, I stated calmly, keeping my voice barely above a whisper. The contrast between her screaming and my quiet stillness only infuriated her more. Your money. She let out a harsh, barking laugh, looking at our mother for support. Mom, do you hear this? She's sitting on a fortune and letting her own family struggle. My kids are applying to Ivy League schools next year. Maya. They are gifted. They are stressed. They need a cultural immersion experience for their college essays. And you're blowing a fortune on caviar in a hotel room? You're just going to sleep in alone. Family helps family. Maya, my mother chimed in, her voice dripping with that familiar, guilt-inducing disappointment. You are a single woman. You don't have children. You don't have the expenses your sister has. It is incredibly selfish to hoard your blessings. I slowly placed my napkin on my lap. And what exactly is the proposed solution to my selfishness? Chloe leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with absolute, delusional greed. She had prepared a speech. You are going to cancel the Ritz. You are going to rebook yourself into a sensible, 3-star hotel, maybe a nice little bed and breakfast. You don't need first-class flights. You can fly premium economy like a normal person. And with the difference, you are going to buy 4 first-class tickets for me and the kids, and book us an adjoining suite at a proper resort. I stared at her. The audacity was so profound, so magnificently stupid, that for a fraction of a second, I almost admired it. Let me ensure I understand, I said, my voice icy and precise. You broke into my home. You stole my financial documents. And now? You are demanding that I downgrade my 50th birthday trip so that I can fund a luxury vacation for you and your children. It's not funding. It's sharing, Chloe screamed, her face turning that familiar blotchy red. You owe this family. What do you even have to celebrate? Maya, turning 50 alone. You're a spinster. You're a gray little mouse pretending to be a billionaire for a week. You wear cheap clothes. You drive a pathetic car. And you think taking one flashy trip is going to change the fact that your life is incredibly, painfully mediocre. Hey, Greg interjected, pointing a thick finger at me. She's right. You're being incredibly arrogant. Chloe works hard holding this family together. The least you can do is show some respect and pitch in. Don't be a piece of trash about this. Trash. The word hung in the air. I looked at Greg. I looked at the slight fraying on the collar of his shirt. I smelled the stale sweat beneath his expensive cologne. I knew, with absolute certainty, that his commercial real estate company was currently 90 days past due on a massive balloon payment to a mezzanine lender. I knew this because, through a series of shell companies, my private equity firm had just purchased that exact debt portfolio 3 weeks ago. I looked at Chloe, trembling with rage, wearing a designer blouse I knew was a high-tier counterfeit because the silk blend didn't drape correctly. They were so desperate to feel superior. They were so desperate to mask the stench of their own rotting financial reality by attempting to tear me down. They thought I was weak because I was quiet. They thought I was a victim because I chose not to bleed on them. The room was silent, waiting for my reaction. They expected tears. They expected an argument. They expected the gray little mouse to either squeak in defense or cower in submission. I did neither. Par trois. The ultimatum and the investigation begins. I did neither. I did not give them the satisfaction of my tears. Nor did I lower myself to the undignified spectacle of a screaming match. The room was practically vibrating with Chloe's manufactured outrage, the air thick and suffocating. But inside my mind, the temperature dropped to absolute zero. I slowly, deliberately pushed my chair back from the dining table. The heavy mahogany legs scraped softly against the hardwood floor, a sound that seemed deafening in the sudden, tense silence that followed Chloe's outburst. I stood up. I picked up my linen napkin, folded it with meticulous precision, and placed it next to my untouched plate. I looked at my mother, whose face was a mask of weak, enabling complacency. I looked at the 3 teenagers, who had momentarily paused their scrolling to watch the drama unfold with bored, bovine expression. Finally, I locked eyes with Chloe and Greg. They were waiting for a capitulation. They were waiting for me to apologize, to offer a compromise, to beg for their approval. I held Chloe's gaze for 5 agonizingly long seconds. I didn't blink. I let the absolute emptiness of my expression reflect her own hollow existence back at her. I saw the exact moment her triumphant smirk faltered, replaced by a microscopic flicker of unease. True power doesn't need to shout to make itself known. It simply occupies the space and suffocates the weak, without a single word. I turned on my heel and walked out of the dining room. I retrieved my coat, walked out the front door, and got into my unassuming beige sedan. As I pulled out of the driveway, I saw the curtains twitch. They thought my silence was a retreat. They thought I was a beaten dog running with its tail between its legs. They had absolutely no idea that they had just initiated their own financial execution. The drive back to Queens was quiet. I didn't listen to music. I listened to the steady, rhythmic hum of the engine, letting my mind shift from the role of the passive sister to the apex predator of distressed assets. When I entered my apartment, the facade dropped. My home, much like myself, was designed to conceal its true nature. Behind a seamless, unnoticeable panel in my minimalist library lay my home office, a soundproof, temperature-controlled command center, equipped with commercial-grade servers and an encrypted multi-monitor workstation linked directly to my firm's mainframe. I bypassed the overhead lights, preferring the cool, blue glow of the monitors. I walked over to a discreet, climate-controlled cabinet built into the wall. I didn't reach for a cheap, supermarket red, I poured myself a precise 2 ounces of a 1,996 Salon Blanc de Blanc champagne into a Baccarat crystal flute. The effervescence was razor-sharp. The taste, a complex symphony of toasted brioche and raw, unforgiving minerality. It was the taste of absolute clarity. I sat down in my Herman Miller Aeron chair, my fingers resting on the mechanical keyboard. "Let's see what you're really made of, Greg," I whispered to the empty room. I bypassed public records. As a senior partner at a top-tier private equity firm, I had legal access to deep-level financial clearinghouses, proprietary risk assessment databases, and the kind of credit monitoring networks that can track a single dollar bill moving through a shadow corporation. I pulled up the corporate filings for Greg's commercial real estate company, Onyx Development Group, to the public. It was a thriving mid-sized developer riding the wave of suburban expansion, but the American economic landscape had fundamentally shifted over the past 3 years. The era of cheap money was dead. The Federal Reserve had aggressively hiked interest rates to combat inflation, and the commercial real estate sector, particularly the B-tier suburban office parks Greg specialized in, was undergoing a catastrophic, bloody correction. It took me less than 45 minutes to perform a complete financial autopsy on his life. The numbers told a story of staggering, almost comical desperation. Greg wasn't just struggling. He was financially terminally ill. His primary asset, a massive commercial plaza on the edge of town, had lost 40% of its valuation due to plunging occupancy rates. To keep the lights on and maintain the illusion of success, he had refinanced the property twice, wiping out any remaining equity, but the traditional banks had cut him off months ago. That's when the rot truly set in. My eyes scanned the digital ledgers, my lips curling into a cold, predatory smile. When the Tier 1 lenders shut their doors, Greg had panicked. To fund Chloe's insatiable appetite for designer labels, to pay the lease on his Range Rover, to maintain the sprawling McMansion, he had turned to the shadow banking sector. He had taken out millions in mezzanine debt and hard money loans from private, unregulated lenders at loan shark interest rates. He was currently bleeding cash just to service the interest, but then I found the fatal flaw. The kill shot. Greg had become sloppy. In his sheer panic to meet a massive margin call on a construction loan 2 months prior, he had crossed a terrifying legal line. He had commingled funds. He had taken hundreds of thousands of dollars from escrow accounts, deposits paid by general contractors and small business tenants, and used them to pay down his personal Padawan high-yield debt. It wasn't just poor business management anymore. It was felony wire fraud. It was embezzlement. He sat back, taking a slow sip of my champagne. The crystal felt heavy and cold against my lips. Chloe had called me a spinster. She had called me a piece of trash. She had demanded I surrender my sanctuary, my 50th birthday, to fund a lifestyle built entirely on stolen money and fraudulent prestige. She believed she was perched at the top of the social hierarchy, looking down on her pathetic, lonely sister. She didn't realize she was standing on a trap door, and I was the one holding the lever. I could have simply tipped off the authorities. A single anonymous email to the SEC and the state licensing board would have had the FBI tearing through Greg's office by Tuesday morning. But that was too clinical. That was too fast. It lacked the poetry of true karma. If they wanted my money so desperately, I decided I would give it to them. I would let them drown in it. I opened a secured, encrypted communication channel to my head of acquisitions in London. It was 3:00 a.m. there. But in my world, money never sleeps. And neither do the people who manage it. I typed out the directives with surgical precision. I authorized the use of an untraceable offshore shell corporation, Ethelgard Holdings, funded entirely by my personal capital. Not the firm's. Target, Onyx Development Group. Directive: identify all secondary and tertiary distressed debt instruments, buy them out, pay a premium if necessary, but acquire every single promissory note, every mezzanine loan, and every outstanding line of credit Greg has in the shadow market. I hit send. I wasn't just going to ruin them. I was going to legally own them. I was going to become the invisible god of their financial universe. And I was going to wait until the absolute perfect moment to let them feel the gravity of their own collapse. The investigation was complete. The trap was set. Now the real fun could begin. Par quatre. The silent execution tightening the noose. Within 72 hours, the digital ink was dry. Ethelgard Holdings, my newly activated, impenetrable offshore shell corporation, had systematically swallowed every single piece of toxic debt attached to Greg's name. I bought his mezzanine loans. I acquired his high-yield promissory notes from the shadow lenders who were all too eager to offload his sinking portfolio for 70 cents on the dollar. Sitting in the cool, blue glow of my home office monitors, I watched the final confirmation wire clear. It was a sterile, quiet moment, utterly devoid of cinematic fanfare. There were no explosions, no dramatic musical swells, just the soft hum of my servers and the profound, absolute knowledge that I now legally owned my brother-in-law. I held the entirety of his financial existence in a heavily encrypted folder on my desktop. I was the majority creditor. If he breathed, it was because I allowed the oxygen to flow through his bank accounts. Now it was time to slowly, methodically, restrict that airflow. I did not initiate a foreclosure. That would be a swift decapitation, and my sister had demanded a slow, agonizing performance. Instead, I instructed my legal team at Ethelgard to trigger a standard, yet létal, mechanism hidden deep within the fine print of his commercial lending contracts. A covenant breach review. Because I possessed undeniable proof that Greg had commingled escrow funds to service his personal debts, a severe violation of his loan agreements, Ethelgard had the legal right to place an immediate blames of hard freeze on all of his operational lines of credit, pending a forensic audit. I sent the directive at 9:00 a.m. on a Tuesday. Bedischench, Lima bless a.m. The financial guillotine dropped. Every single corporate card Greg possessed was deactivated. His business checking accounts, which held the payroll for his remaining contractors, were locked in administrative purgatory. He had zero liquidity. He couldn't buy a cup of coffee without my invisible permission, let alone make the massive balloon payments due at the end of the month. The ripple effect was immediate, and I watched it unfold with the detached, clinical fascination of a biologist observing a microbe under a microscope. Clue. Entirely oblivious to the fact that her husband's empire had just been vaporized, was still operating under the delusional assumption that she had successfully bullied me into funding her Parisian vacation. She decided she needed a new wardrobe for the Avenue des Champs-Élysées. Through a combination of credit monitoring alerts, which I now legally possessed as their primary debt holder, I tracked her movements. She walked into an ultra-exclusive, appointment-only boutique in Manhattan's Upper East Side. I could perfectly picture her, dripping in her loud, ostentatious jewelry. Treating the sales associates like indentured servants, she attempted to purchase a beautifully tailored, virgin wool trench coat and 3 silk blouses. The total was roughly $9,000. She handed the perfectly manicured sales associate her heavy, metal platinum credit card. I imagined the quiet beep of the terminal, the slight, professional hesitation of the associate, the discreet, softly spoken words that strike absolute terror into the hearts of the fake rich. "I'm so sorry, Mom, but this card has been declined. Do you have another form of payment?" Clue. Naturally, would have scoffed. She would have blamed the bank's fraud protection. She would have aggressively rummaged through her oversized monogramme Torbay, producing a second card. Declined. Error code 51. Insufficient funds. A third card. A joint account tied to Greg's supposedly bottomless business equity. Declined. Account frozen. Please contact administrator. The psychological devastation of that moment must have been exquisite. In the hushed, heavily scented air of that luxury boutique, surrounded by the quiet elegance she so desperately wanted to possess, Chloe's fabricated reality shattered. The polite, unblinking stares of the sales associates would have felt like physical blows. She had to leave the clothes on the counter, her face burning with the deep, acidic shame of a fraud exposed in broad daylight, fleeing the store with nothing but her empty ego. Back at their sprawling, hollow McMansion, The atmosphere was turning toxic. I didn't need cameras in their house to know what was happening. The financial data painted a vivid Plater-day, agonizing masterpiece. Greg was desperately trying to contact his lenders, screaming into the phone, demanding to know who or what Ethelgard Holdings was. But my firm was a ghost. He was fighting a shadow that was slowly strangling him. He was sweating through his shirts, drinking cheap scotch. He had poured into an expensive crystal decanter to maintain the illusion for his oblivious children. The panic began to erode Chloe's carefully curated social media facade. To the world, she was still posting perfectly filtered photos with captions like, "So stressed preparing for Europe, blessed jet-setter." But reality was demanding cash. 2 days after the boutique humiliation, my monitors flagged a peculiar transaction. Chloe had visited a discreet, high-end pawnbroker in the Diamond District. She was attempting to liquidate what she believed were her investment pieces, the heavy, gaudy necklaces and tennis bracelets. Greg had bought her over the years to apologize for his constant absences. The tragedy, which made me smile, a cold, genuine smile in the silence of my office, was that Greg had lied to her. 2. The pawnbroker's appraisal, which registered in my network through a background credit check they ran on her, revealed the truth. The diamonds she wore so proudly were mostly lab-grown or heavily included, commercial-grade stones. The settings weren't solid platinum. They were cheap alloys, plated in rhodium. The extravagant jewelry she used to bludgeon other women with her supposed wealth was practically worthless on the secondary market. She walked out of the pawnshop with less than $3,000 in cash, barely enough to cover 1 month's lease on her luxury SUV. They were drowning. They were suffocating under the weight of their own arrogance and deceit, and they were turning on each other. I could see the sudden spike in late-night, low-balance transactions at local bars for Greg, and the frantic disorganized shifting of hundreds of dollars between Chloe's personal checking accounts, trying to cover bounced checks for her country club dues. They were terrified, and in profound contrast to their chaotic, desperate unraveling, my apartment remained an oasis of absolute tranquility. I spent my evenings preparing for Paris. I didn't pack heavily branded trunks. I carefully folded my garments into a bespoke, un logo leather weekender bay. I packed a coat woven from pure, undyed vicuña wool, a fabric so exquisitely soft and rare, it made Chloe's synthetic blends feel like sandpaper. I packed perfectly tailored, quiet pieces that whispered of generational wealth, not the screaming insecurity of new money. I was completely unbothered. I had removed the cancer of their entitlement from my life, and I had done it using the very system they worshipped but fundamentally misunderstood. To ensure maximum devastation, I had one final move to make before I left for the airport. I needed to ensure they showed up at the terminal. I needed them to bring their overstuffed bags, their arrogant expectations, and their absolute certainty that I would eventually bend to their will. I logged into my private email server and began drafting a meticulously fabricated travel itinerary. The trap was ready to be sprung. Par 5. The yes trap and the airport trap. To execute a truly flawless demolition, you cannot simply push your target off a cliff. You must convince them to build the cliff themselves, climb to the very edge, and demand that you watch them fly. I needed to ensure that my sister's humiliation was not confined to the walls of our mother's dining room. It needed to be public. It needed to be inescapable. Most importantly, it needed to happen at the exact moment she believed she had won. Sitting in the absolute silence of my home office, I opened Adobe Acrobat. It took me precisely 12 minutes to alter the original PDF of my Air France itinerary. I didn't change my first-class booking, but below my name, I added 4 highly realistic confirmation numbers. I didn't put Chloe and her children in first class. I didn't even put them in premium economy. I placed them in the absolute last row of the aircraft, wedged tightly against the lavatories and the galley. I exported the document, attached it to an email, and sent it to Chloe with a simple, 2-word subject line. For Mum? I knew exactly how her parasitic psychology would process this bait. Her initial reaction would be violently indignant. How dare the boring spinster put her precious Ivy League-bound prodigies in steerage? but her pathological greed would instantly override her pride. She would convince herself that this economy booking was merely my opening offer, a weak attempt at a compromise. She would accept the trap, fully planning to ambush me at the airport check-in desk, use the public setting to embarrass me into submission, and physically strip the first-class boarding pass from my hands. She was as predictable as gravity. The morning of my departure, New York City was weeping a cold, steady, miserable drizzle. Inside my apartment, it was warm, quiet, and immaculate. I moved through my morning routine with the calm, measured precision of a surgeon preparing for theater. I dressed in clothing designed for invisible comfort, a pair of custom-tailored, dark charcoal, Loro Piana cashmere trousers, and a lightweight dove gray silk turtleneck. There was not a single visible logo on my body. It was the quiet, bulletproof armor of true, unbothered wealth. My private transport, an unbadged, heavily armored black Audi A8, driven by a professional named Thomas, who understood the luxury of absolute silence, waited idling at the curb. The drive to John F. Kennedy International Airport was peaceful. I watched the gray city blur past the rain-streaked windows, sipping a double espresso from a thermos, feeling the exquisite, tightening anticipation of the final act. Terminal 1 at JFK is a chaotic, fluorescent-lit purgatory of screaming children, delayed flights, and frayed nerves. However, the Air France La Première check-in area is designed as a sanctuary from the masses. It is an enclosed, hushed pavilion separated from the main concourse by frosted glass and velvet ropes. The air smells faintly of expensive cedar and fresh lilies. The acoustics are engineered to swallow noise. I arrived 2 hours early. I was standing at the polished mahogany check-in desk, softly conversing in fluent French with Laurent, the impossibly elegant ticketing concierge. When the sanctuary was violently breached, they looked like a traveling circus of financial insecurity. Chloe shoved aggressively through the frosted glass doors, her voice immediately shattering the sacred, expensive silence of the room. She was wearing massive, mirrored designer sunglasses indoors, a faux fur-trimmed coat, and trailing 3 enormous plain, scuffed Louis Vuitton suitcases. I noted with a clinical, quiet amusement that the monogrammed canvas on her luggage was visibly peeling at the corners, a glaring that clues, undeniable hallmark of poor counterfeit quality. Behind her slouched her 3 teenagers, glued to their glowing screens, wearing oversized, violently branded hoodies, completely detached from their surroundings. And then, there was Greg. Looking at my brother-in-law was like looking at a ghost that hadn't realized it was dead yet. He was trailing behind his family, hauling his own oversized bag. The deep, bruised bags under his eyes, and his ashen, gray complexion told me everything I needed to know. My forensic audit was choking him to death. His phone had likely been ringing non-stop for 48 hours with furious creditors and locked accounts. He was a dead man walking, physically present in the airport, but financially buried beneath a mountain of my toxic debt. He was trying to hold up the facade for his wife, but the terror sweating through his pores was palpable. Chloe didn't even acknowledge the concierge. She marched directly toward me, radiating a toxic, frantic energy. "Maya," she barked, her voice echoing harshly off the marble floors. Several other high-net-worth passengers in the lounge slowly turned their heads, their expressions masks of polite disgust at the vulgar intrusion. "We need to get this sorted out right now," Chloe demanded, pointing a French manicured finger at my chest. "I don't know what kind of passive-aggressive, sick joke you thought you were playing, putting my kids next to the bathrooms in economy. But the game is over. You are marching up to that desk and upgrading us. Now you can take one of the back seats. You're smaller anyway, and you don't have the stress of managing a family. You owe us this." I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I let her finish her pathetic, entitled monologue. Laurent, the ticketing agent, looked visibly distressed by the assault. He looked at me, his eyes silently pleading for permission to summon the airport security detail that was already hovering near the entrance. I gave him a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of my head. "Not yet." The trap hadn't snapped shut. "Passports, please." Madame, Laurent said, his voice a soothing, professional balm against Chloe's screeching. I retrieved my dark blue, heavily stamped passport from my soft leather tote bag and slid it smoothly across the mahogany counter. Chloe slammed her hand down on the desk, the cheap metal of her fake Cartier bracelets clanking loudly. "Excuse me," she snapped at Laurent. "We are all checking in together. She is paying for our upgrades." She turned and snapped her fingers at her husband. "Greg, give him our passports." Greg hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket. I turned my body slowly to face Chloe. I didn't smile. I let the absolute, freezing emptiness of my composure wash over her. I stripped away the facade of the quiet, submissive sister, and let her look directly into the eyes of the apex predator that had just swallowed her husband's empire whole. "I think there has been a profound misunderstanding. Clue," I said, my voice perfectly modulated, smooth and cold like crushed glass. "Excuse me?" Chloe's voice cracked, a shrill note of sudden, unexplainable panic piercing her aggressive bravado. She sensed the shift in the atmosphere. "We had a deal. Mom said you had to do this. You sent the itinerary. I sent you a fabricated piece of paper to ensure you would pack your fake bags, drag your miserable husband here, and stand exactly where you are standing right now," I replied softly, leaning in just a fraction of an inch, ensuring only she and Greg could hear my next words. "I only have one ticket. I never booked you anything. In fact, Chloe, you're not going anywhere." Parsis. The climax and the final flex. The silence that followed my words was not peaceful. It was a vacuum. It was the terrifying, breathless void that exists in the fraction of a second after a bomb detonates but before the shockwave hits. For 3 agonizingly long seconds, Chloe's brain simply refused to process the data. She stood frozen, her mouth slightly ajar, the cheap, overly shiny fabric of her fake fur coat trembling under the harsh fluorescent lights, spilling in from the main terminal. She looked at Laurent, the impeccably calm ticketing agent. She looked at the single, present, NIE, heavy cardstock boarding pass resting on the mahogany counter. And then, the reality of her profound humiliation finally breached her delusions. The meltdown was biblical. "You liar." Chloe shrieked, the sound tearing through the hushed, cedar-scented elegance of the La Première lounge like a chainsaw. It wasn't just anger, it was a feral, visceral panic. The kind of panic that sets in when a parasite realizes the host has abruptly vanished. "You sick, twisted, pathetic liar. You think you can do this to us? You think you can embarrass me in front of my children?" She slammed both hands violently onto the check-in desk, knocking over a small, crystal vase of white orchids. The water spilled across the polished wood, dripping onto her cheap, scuffed luggage. Her 3 teenagers finally looked up from their glowing screens. The bored, detached expressions had been wiped clean, replaced by wide-eyed, genuine alarm. For the first time in their incredibly sheltered, entitled lives, they were witnessing the absolute failure of their mother's bullying. The infinite bank of mom and dad was suddenly, violently malfunctioning in public. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the airport security detail, 3 large, heavily armed officers in crisp blue uniforms unclip their radios and begin a swift, purposeful march toward our position. Laurent reached for his telephone to call for immediate backup, but I gently placed my hand over his. "Give me exactly 60 seconds. Laurent," I murmured softly. He paused, nodding once, his eyes locked on my completely unbothered demeanor. I ignored Chloe entirely. She was screaming, her face contorted into an ugly, blotchy mask of rage, demanding that Laurent summon his manager, demanding that someone arrest me for fraud. But her words were just meaningless. Chaotic noise? I slowly turned my body away from my sister and stepped directly into Greg's personal space. He hadn't moved a muscle since I spoke. He was staring at me with a look of dawning, paralyzing horror. The deep, bruised bags under his eyes seemed to have darkened in the last 5 minutes. He smelled of stale, cheap scotch, nervous sweat, and the unmistakable, metallic scent of pure, unadulterated fear. I leaned in, I didn't raise my voice. I spoke in a whisper so soft, so brutally intimate, that it cut straight through Chloe's screaming and landed directly in the center of his chest. UCC article 9. I whispered. Greg stopped breathing. His jaw dropped a fraction of an inch. Ethelgard Holdings. I continued, letting the syllables roll off my tongue with agonizing slowness, and a massive, uncurable default on your mezzanine bridge loans. Watching a man's soul leave his body is a peculiar thing. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in micro-expressions. I watched the blood rapidly drain from Greg's face, leaving him the color of wet ash. His eyes widened, the pupils dilating in sheer, primal terror. His knees actually buckled, just a fraction, before he caught himself. The aggressive, fake rich real estate developer evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, broken shell of a man drowning in a sea of toxic debt. He understood, in that single, frozen moment, looking into the cold, dead eyes of the boring spinster accountant. Greg realized exactly who I was. He realized why his lines of credit had vanished. He realized why his corporate cards were bouncing. I reached into my unbranded, beautifully crafted vicuña wool tote bag and pulled out a sleek, matte black leather document folder. It was heavy. It contained the weight of his entire destroyed existence. I pressed the folder flat against his chest. His trembling hands automatically came up to grip it. "What is that?" Chloe snapped, her screaming faltering for a moment as she noticed her husband's physical collapse. "Greg, what is she giving you?" "Throw it in her face." Greg didn't look at her. He couldn't. He opened the heavy black cover with shaking fingers. Inside rested the absolute, undeniable proof of his execution. The top document was a formal notice of default and intent to foreclose, stamped with the seal of the state of New York, listing Ethelgard Holdings as the primary lien holder. Below that was a court order freezing all remaining personal and business assets due to credible evidence of wire fraud and the commingling of escrow funds. And below that, the hostile takeover documents for Onyx Development Group. "I am the majority debt holder of your pathetic, sinking ship." "Greg," I whispered, my voice carrying the lethal, quiet authority of a financial grim reaper. "I own your company. I own your commercial plaza. I own the cars you lease. And by the time the sun sets today, I will officially own that hollow, over-mortgaged McMansion you left this morning." A pathetic, strangled whimper escaped Greg's throat. He looked from the papers to me, his eyes begging for a mercy he didn't deserve and would never receive. "You thought I was weak because I was quiet," I said, a slow, razor-sharp smile finally touching my lips. "You thought you could steal my peace to fund your fraudulent, plastic life? But you misunderstood the fundamental rule of power. Greg, true wealth doesn't scream. True wealth just buys the ground you stand on and waits for you to fall." "Greg, what is she talking about?" Chloe demanded, her voice dropping from a shriek to a desperate, trembling whine. She grabbed his arm, shaking him. "Greg, say something. Tell her to shut up. Let's go to our gate." "There is no gate." "Chloe," Greg whispered, his voice cracking, completely devoid of life. The folder slipped from his trembling hands, hitting the marble floor with a heavy thud, scattering the foreclosure notices across the polished stone. "There is nothing left. It's all gone." The 3 security officers finally arrived, forming a tight, imposing wall between me and my disintegrating family. "Is there a problem here?" "Ma'am," the lead officer asked, looking at my calm demeanor, then at Chloe's tear-streaked, chaotic face. "No problem at all, officer," I replied smoothly, picking up my La Premiere boarding pass from the mahogany counter. These people were just leaving. They seemed to be deeply lost. I turned my back on them. I didn't wait to see Chloe's reaction as she picked up the papers. I didn't wait to hear the wails of her teenagers as they realized their Ivy League trust funds had just evaporated into the shadow market. I had surgically removed the cancer. The operation was a complete success. "Have a magnificent flight to Paris, Madame," Laurent said quietly, a faint, knowing smile on his face as he gestured toward the private VIP security lane. A personal escort dressed in impeccable Air France Navy was waiting to take my bag. "Thank you, Laurent," I smiled genuinely. I walked away, my footsteps making absolutely no sound on the thick, plush carpet of the private corridor. Behind me, the muffled sounds of my sister's hysterical sobbing and my brother-in-law's hyperventilation faded into nothingness. Enjoy the suburbs, I murmured to the empty air. I hear the repo men are already at your gates. On part set. Selfies from Paris and the Karma. The air at 35,000 feet is notoriously dry and unforgiving, but inside the private, velvet-lined sanctuary of the first-class suite, it felt like breathing pure, distilled peace. I spent the transatlantic flight wrapped in a heavy, impossibly soft cashmere blanket, sipping a rare, Vinteuil Reserve champagne, and reading a physical book. There was no Wi-Fi connected. There was no digital noise. For 7 hours, I existed in a beautiful, untouchable vacuum, suspended miles above the messy, chaotic ruin I had left behind on the tarmac. Paris greeted me with a soft, silver-gray morning light. There were no lines at customs. My private, unbadged town car was waiting on the tarmac, the driver standing with quiet, military-like posture. The drive into the city was a sensory reawakening, the scent of rain on cobblestones, the distant, muffled hum of the waking city, the architectural majesty of centuries-old stone. It was the exact opposite of the cheap, plastic, disposable world my sister inhabited. When the heavy, gilded doors of the Ritz Paris closed behind me, shutting out the outside world, I finally exhaled. The prestige suite was a masterpiece of understated opulence. There were no glaring logos, no aggressive modern art, trying too hard to impress. Just high ceilings, antique silk drapes that pooled heavily on the floor, and a private balcony overlooking the pristine symmetry of the Place Vendôme. I ordered a simple breakfast, a pot of freshly pressed espresso, perfectly flaky, warm croissant, and a small dish of salted beurre de barat. It was only after I had poured my first cup of coffee, the rich aroma filling the suite, that I finally took my phone out of my tote bag and turned off airplane mode. The digital carnage was immediate and spectacular. My screen instantly froze for a solid 10 seconds as the notifications flooded in like a breached dam. There were 47 missed calls from my mother, 82 text messages from Chloe, a dozen frantic emails from various family members who had been caught in the blast radius of the explosion. I took a slow sip of my espresso, the bitter warmth perfectly cutting the chill of the morning, and opened the voicemails. I didn't listen to all of them. I only needed a taste. The first was from my mother, her voice a wavering, tearful mess of guilt-tripping and denial. Maya, please. You have to fix this. Greg is having a breakdown. They took his car. Maya. Right out of the driveway. You are tearing this family apart. How could you be so cruel? I deleted it halfway through. I had not torn the family apart. I had simply removed the financial scaffolding that allowed their dysfunction to stand tall. Then I opened Chloe's text messages. Watching her psychological descent through the timestamps was a masterclass in the anatomy of entitlement. The first few texts, sent moments after I walked away in the airport, were pure, venomous rage, threats of lawsuits, promises of physical violence, screaming in all caps that I was a monster. But as the hours ticked by, as the reality of my hostile takeover fully materialized, the tone shifted. The aggression dissolved into absolute, hyperventilating panic. Maya, please pick up. Greg's accounts are all locked. We can't even buy groceries. Please tell your company to turn the cards back on. Maya, I'm begging you. The repo trucks are here. They are hooking up my SUV. The neighbors are watching. Please stop this. That last text painted a vivid, exquisite picture in my mind. I could see it perfectly. Their sprawling, deeply mortgaged suburban street, the manicured lawns, and right in the center of it all, a massive, grinding tow truck, dragging Chloe's least symbol of superiority down the driveway in broad daylight. I imagined the curtains twitching in the neighboring houses. I imagined the searing, deeply physical burn of public humiliation washing over her as the country club elite watched her fake rich facade collapse into literal dust. They were ruined. Legally, completely, and undeniably ruined. Greg's commercial real estate company was now just another distressed asset in my portfolio. One that I would quietly liquidate and sell for parts by the end of the fiscal quarter. Their house would be seized by the end of the month. I placed my phone face down on the marble table. I didn't feel malicious glee. I didn't feel a wicked, cartoonish joy. What I felt was a profound, deeply satisfying sense of equilibrium. The universe had been out of balance. A parasite had been feeding on my quiet existence, demanding my resources to fuel its own delusions. I hadn't been cruel. I had simply audited their lives, found them morally and financially bankrupt, and closed the account. I spent the next 3 days completely disconnected. I wandered through the hushed, cavernous halls of the Louvre after hours. I dined in quiet, tucked-away restaurants where the chefs prepared tasting menus that felt like poetry. I slept deeply, dreamlessly, surrounded by the heavy silence of true security. On the fourth evening, as the sun dipped below the Parisian skyline, painting the clouds in bruised shades of violet and gold, I dressed for dinner. I wore a backless, midnight blue silk gown that fit like a second skin. I poured a glass of a 2002 vintage champagne into a heavy crystal flute. I walked out onto my private balcony. The air was cool and smelled of impending rain and blooming jasmine. In the distance, the Eiffel Tower suddenly erupted into its hourly glittering light show, piercing the twilight like a beacon of absolute triumph. I picked up my phone. I opened the camera. I didn't use a filter. I didn't need one. I stood with the sparkling iron monument behind me, the crystal glass held elegantly in my hand. My face was relaxed, glowing with the undeniable, radiant peace of a woman who had just successfully taken out the trash. I took a single, flawless selfie. I opened the group chat containing Chloe, Greg, and my mother. I didn't type a paragraph defending myself. I didn't offer a compromise. I didn't offer a single word of explanation. Explanations are for people who seek permission, and I answered to no one. I attached the photo. I hit send. And then, with a calm, steady thumb, I permanently blocked all of their numbers. I set the phone down, took a slow, luxurious sip of my champagne, and watched the lights of Paris dance in the dark. So here we are. Some people in the comments will inevitably call me cold. They will say that family is family, and that blood dictates endless forgiveness. But if you have ever been the quiet one, the responsible one, the one expected to shrink so that toxic people can feel tall, you understand? You understand that sometimes the only way to cure a sickness is to completely burn the infection to the ground. Some call it cruel. I call it a financial audit. If you enjoyed watching a fake empire crumble, leave a comment below. I want to know, what is the most insanely entitled thing a toxic family member has ever demanded from you? And how did you shut it down? Hit that like button if you believe in the absolute beauty of karma. And make sure you are subscribed to the channel. We have a lot more scores to settle, and you won't want to miss the next one. Until then, stay quiet, stay smart, and never let them see you coming.